Today, guys, I'd like to talk to you about the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt, or as he's more commonly known nowadays as Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy was one of the United States presidents who was leader of our country at the turn of the century back in the early 1900s. And when you think of presidents, you think of them as being tough. Presidents have to be tough because they deal with dignitaries from other countries and leaders from other places, but to actually be physically tough, both mentally and physically tough, Theodore Roosevelt had to be that. One example of how tough this man was that as president, he had a boxing ring built into the basement of the White House. And while he was sparring one night, after being president all day long, he actually had an injury that connected with his left eye. He ended up being blind in his left eye for the remainder of his presidency and the remainder of his life. So this is how tough of a man we're talking about. And he had to be tough, which is why his legacy has lived on from his time as presidency till now, and while he kind of was a trailblazer for what we consider to be a modern president. He was the youngest president to ever be elected, so he had to get tough quick because he was the vice president, and the president before him was assassinated, President McKinley. So he actually took office as the youngest president in the history of the United States. He took office at 42 years old. He was forced the presidency because of the assassination, and ended up winning the presidency the next year by vote and through his party, the GOP. But the title of the youngest president ever elected duly was John F. Kennedy. But at the time, Teddy Roosevelt holds the honor as being the youngest person ever to be president. He was president at 42 years old. One of the things that Roosevelt was a major contributor to for what we can recognize as presidents nowadays is that he was the first president to ever leave the continental United States up to that point. And some of the things that he did was he actually traveled to the Panama Canal and oversaw the construction of the Panama Canal, which meant he had to leave the United States, which something the president has never done before. So he really took a hands-on approach to the project. He actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for being a mediator, a negotiator during the Japanese and Russo War. As a result of his negotiation tactics and the ability to open up conversation between these two warring states, he will later receive the Nobel Prize, the only American to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. He was also the first president to ever fly. We see presidents flying all over the place now in Air Force One or in Marine One in a helicopter, but he was the first president to do it. Now, granted, he was back in the early 1900s when planes weren't as common as they are today, but that's kind of why he's recognized as kind of a trailblazer. He flew on one of the first passenger planes to have ever existed that were created by the Wright brothers. Roosevelt took that risk and got on that plane. It was a 4-minute flight, but he's credited as being the first president to ever leave the soil by plane and land again. He was also a well-known conservationist. So with that toughness, with that physical and mental toughness that he had to take the office at the young age and basically having a presidency forced onto him, he was also adamant about keeping the wildlife ecology growing. So he's helped spearhead what we now recognize as the Department of Agriculture. He took somebody from the Department of the Interior, took him over to a separate department called the Department of Agriculture, and he basically said, hey, your responsibility is to make sure that our wildlife is growing and prospering and doing well. He was also responsible for creating 5 national parks that are still active today and 18 national monuments that are all also still active today. So we're talking 100 years has gone since he made these creations during his presidency, and they're still around today. If that's not a lasting impact, I don't know what is. So I hope you've recognized how great of a man Teddy Roosevelt was and what kind of a legacy that we can honor and commemorate during his time as president. You know, we had George Washington and his leadership during the basically creation of the nation that we live in today, all the way to Abraham Lincoln and his effect on the Civil War. But presidents, they're expected to lead from the front, and Teddy Roosevelt was a great example of what it was to lead from the front. Whether it was his ability as a negotiator to bring 2 conflicting states to a resolution, or his willingness to risk himself for the greater good, through the plane rides or going down the Panama Canal on his own, he really showed what it would be like to be hands-on as a president. And that's one of the reasons why I believe his legacy has lasted as long as it has, and we still remember him today.